Thomas Sowell defines the title of his book, Preferential Policies, as government-mandated preferences for government-designated groups. During this 1990 Book Notes interview, he argued that these policies tend to favor groups whose members are already more fortunate, resulting in ethnic polarization. It's an hour.
Like this right now?
Because some of the issues that have been fought over are now coming to a head, especially with the Civil Rights Act of 1990, so-called, up before Congress, and especially in the light of Supreme Court decisions of last year, which have been called a cutback in civil rights, but which in fact I think are a corrective to many of the things that have been going on. I'm really worried about the attempt to reverse the Ward's-Cove decision, because I think that's the first case where a company was being prosecuted not because of any act of discrimination against any individual, not even because their numbers of employees were less than the numbers of the group in the population, but because they had a larger proportion of non-whites in the lower levels than they had in the upper levels. And if that decision is reversed, that will mean that employers will have an incentive not to hire as many working-class minority people and to try to hire more elite position minority people.
What's the Ward's Cove decision?
Well, Ward's Cove was a Ward's Cove packing company in Seattle, ran a cannery up in, still does, in Alaska. They hired the permanent and higher level people in around where their headquarters are in Seattle, Pacific Northwest. And up in Alaska, since there was only seasonal work during the salmon season, they would hire local people for that. It makes sense. And they happened to be located where there are a number of Eskimos, and there was a union that had a lot of Filipinos in it. And the net result was they had a predominantly white permanent staff and a predominantly non-white set of cannery workers. And there were other there are always subsidiary issues involved, but by the time the case got to the Supreme Court, all those other issues had been shot down, so that there was no question of anybody being discriminated against in hiring, no individual being discriminated against in treatment on the job. All that had been shot down in the lower courts. Now all that was before the Supreme Court was that the statistics looked bad, that they had all these non-white cannery workers and all these, well, not all white, but predominantly white upper-level workers. And the idea was they were supposed to be convicted of discrimination on that basis, and the Supreme Court wouldn't buy it, and they voted 5-4 that they wouldn't. And now the act before Congress is going to make it possible to convict a company on that basis. Even before the Ward's Cove decision, I had heard from people who are knowledgeable about civil rights that attorneys were advising their employer clients, if you can't find black engineers or black accountants, then at least don't hire so many black janitors or assembly line workers, because it looks bad. And if they succeed, that means that it will hurt the people who most need a job, and it will benefit, if anyone, only a handful of people in elite positions.
You put or try to pop the balloon of a lot of what you call myths in this book about preferential treatment and whether or not it works. Is there any case, what you've studied, where going out and actively pursuing and preferring one group over the other that's helped that group?
Oh, I suppose Sri Lanka, perhaps. The question is, how much did it help them, and in what ways? In Sri Lanka, the Tamils are the minority, and the Sinhalese are the majority, and the preferences in that country are for the majority, the Sinhalese, because the Tamils had done quite well. And after a number of years, the Sinhalese were able to overtake the Tamils in income. But along the way, they had such violence in the street that people were burning each other alive in the street. The army, which is predominantly Sinhalese, when attacked in Tamil territory, has been known simply to stop a bus and take people off the bus and shoot a few of them at random because they're Tamils. And so if you say that's been a success, then it's been a success. But I'm not sure we want that kind of success.
You break your book up in several sections around some of your travels, and you focus on Sri Lanka and India and Nigeria and Malaysia and the United States. Did you go to all those places?
I went to not Sri Lanka and Nigeria, but to the India, Malaysia, also to other places that are mentioned in passing, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji. Israel also has some preferential policies. You can't, in school, you can't leave back a disproportionate number of Sephardic Jews as compared to Ashkenazic Jews. Otherwise, that's considered bad.
Are there differences with people and races, differences in talent and intelligence and all those things? Since you've been studying, have you noticed differences around the world?
Well, there are differences in skills, if that's what you mean. That is, Germans have been prominent in piano manufacturing around the world, in the Tsarist Russia or Australia or the United States and so on. Underlying differences, those I've argued against, genetic differences, and those I've argued against, but that's another whole issue that I really don't get into in the book.
Why do then the different parts of the society do better than others?
I would look at it differently. I would say, and especially in the United States, I would say, why would we expect the different groups to do the same? I say especially the United States because there are very few indigenous Americans. Americans that come here from all over the world. And why would you ever expect that countries that had entirely different histories, located in entirely different climates, different geography, why would you expect those countries to develop exactly the same mix of skills to exactly the same degree so that their people would arrive on these shores in such a way that they would be represented evenly across the board? Especially since even in countries where most of the population is indigenous, you don't find it there. The Germans arrived here with piano-making skills, and therefore you shouldn't expect to find the Irish equally represented with Germans in the piano industry. So when you find Steinways and other German named pianos, you shouldn't expect to find O'Houlihan pianos to the same extent, and so on. Nowhere in the world do you find this evenness that people use as a norm. And I find it fascinating that they will hold up as a norm something that has never been seen on this planet and regard as an anomaly something that is seen in country after country.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up, I guess, in Harlem. I was born in North Carolina.
And your parents moved to Harlem?
Yes.
Where'd you go to school?
And right in the middle of Harlem, PS5.
And college?
I went to Howard University in Washington for a year and a half, and then I transferred to Harvard.
Who most influenced you in your early life to become a student and then now a professor at Stanford?
Oh, good heavens. There'd be so many people. I think my family itself would be the biggest influence. When they came out of the South, their thought was that I would have opportunities which they had never had, and that they wanted me to take advantage of it. And more than that, they realized that there was no way that they, either in terms of money or in terms of education, would be able to do that. And so they looked around for people for me to meet that would help me in some way. And there was a kid named Eddie Mapp that they had picked out for me to meet before I ever got off the train. And Eddie Mapp was from the West Indies, and his mother was much more educated than the members of my family. And Eddie Mapp began to tell me various things, such as that one school was better than another, which would not have occurred to me until it was too late. And that one could transfer so that one could get into a better school. And of course I didn't. He was about a year older than me. And so I was, in effect, able to follow in his footsteps. And I learned about Stuyvesant High School in New York and took the test and got into there and so on. So I got a very good foundation, largely because of him. He introduced me to my first public library. I remember standing in this room with these tremendous numbers of books and asking, why are we here? Because I don't have any money to buy books. And then he had to tell me what a public library was, and I was about 9 years old. And then once we tried it out, I was like, sounds like a good idea.
When did you write your first book? And by the way, did I count 16 books? No.
Oh, well, a lot depends on how you count them. If you count collections of old stuff, then you get a bigger number than if you count books that are real books from scratch.
This in the front of your book here, they've listed a whole bunch of them.
I think that's maybe the 14th, if I've counted correctly.
And when did you write your first book?
Oh, I started writing it in 1970. It was published. No, I started writing it in 1970. It was published in 71.
And what was it?
It was Economics, Analysis, and Issues, introductory economics textbook.
So it is a textbook today?
No, it sank without a trace.
Sank without a trace.
Yes.
What did you learn from that first experience? What didn't work?
Oh, almost everything didn't work. One thing I never published with that publisher again. That's just for starters. They brought it out at the wrong time. They changed what I had done. One of the features I had was that when I teach, I used to use different colors of chalk. And I found that the students were able to follow complicated graphs better if I had each line in a different color. And I can say, you know, the gross national product, which is in green, and then they could follow that along and so on. So I'd done this whole book the same way, and it came out in black and white. And that was one of the many little things. But
What's your favorite book out of the 14?
A Conflict of Visions.
Why?
I think it's what is more mine than anything else, in the sense that it doesn't build upon any theory that anyone else has or anything that's already out there in the literature. And it's an attempt to explain why people reach different ideological positions from one another. How two people similarly informed, similarly well-meaning, will reach opposite conclusions, not just on a given issue, but on the whole range of issues. That if you were to take a resolution about military spending and take it to a pro-choice meeting and to a pro-life meeting, you would probably get a very different reading on it. Or if you took all sorts of other things wholly unrelated to the abortion question to those same two meetings, you would probably get entirely different readings on those other unrelated questions because their positions grow out of a certain vision of the world. And if you have that vision of the world, then certain things make perfect sense and certain other things make no sense at all.
How long have you been at Stanford?
10 years.
What do you teach?
Absolutely nothing. I'm not a professor at Stanford. I'm a senior fellow, which means that I don't do any teaching. In fact, I have no hours and no duties. And once I was an expert witness in a case, and the opposing attorney said to me, "It says here that you're a senior fellow. Now, just what does a senior fellow do?" And I said, "Well, actually, a senior fellow has no hours and no duties." And the judge said, "I wouldn't mind having a job like that." So it's really the ideal kind of job.
So what do you do?
I write. I read.
Do you lecture?
Occasionally, but that's not required of me.
Do you have much association with students today?
None. Occasionally, a student will stop me on the campus and chit-chat, but aside from that, that will happen in the streets of Washington. So I have no connection whatever with the teaching at Stanford University.
You write a newspaper column?
Yes.
How often?
Once a week.
What's the impact of that?
I have no idea, except when I get letters from people. I don't even know in what papers it appears. I send it to the syndicate, and that's the syndicate's problem from there on. And they pay me a fixed amount, so there's no need for them to give me an accounting.
Over the last 10 years of our call-in shows, I'll bet you we've had 25 people call up and say, "Why don't you get Thomas Sowell on to talk about this issue?" I've seen you once on television in my life on Meet the Press a couple years ago. This is the first time we've met, and it just leads me to the question of, why have we not seen more of you? Have you avoided television? And if you have, for what reason?
Well, I guess it's a question of where your advantages lie. My advantages lie in writing the books. And in order to do the amount of work that I do, there are many other things I don't do. And unfortunately, there are very few people who take positions similar to mine. And if that viewpoint is to be heard at all, I'm going to have to be the one that does a lot of it. And therefore, I can't do a lot of other things. As regards television, there are many problems with television, not the least of which are those shows where they tape you for an hour and a half and put you on for 5 minutes with other people interspliced to say what they have to say. And I don't go for that format at all, because it will end up proving whatever the people wanted to prove at the beginning.
Have you consciously avoided television for that reason?
Those kinds of television shows, yes.
And when you say you write books, and we obviously have this list here, do you have a plan over a period of your life of what kind of things you want to write about?
Not really. It's what really just appeals to me at the time. The first time I was contacted by the Hoover Institution, they asked me what I wanted to do research on if I came there, and I said I wanted to write about Marxian economics. And some years later, and that didn't come to fruition at the time, and some years later, they came to me again, and then they asked what would I like to do, and I said Marxian economics. And so I made an appointment, and I started studying Marxian economics. And in my spare time, I was reading a book called The Chinese in Southeast Asia. And I got so fascinated that 2 months into this, I put Marxian economics to one side, and I began to learn more about the Chinese and Southeast Asia and so forth. And then the book, The Economics and Politics of Race, came out of that. And then I decided